Now, the other day I did a video about The Last Jedi, how it's been 5 years somehow since it came out, and in it I talked about how there is a certain portion of the fan base who likes and defends that movie simply because they like anything and everything Star Wars. Basically, there are fans who refuse to be critical of any part of the franchise because they see always being positive as some type of, I don't know, a badge of honor, like it makes them better fans essentially to always say only good things about it. And though, as I talked about in that video, it's not the only reason some fans like The Last Jedi, they certainly do exist, and though I'm not one today, I'm certainly not afraid to call out bad Star Wars when I see it and risk the ire of the fans who do love it unconditionally. It is still a mindset I know and understand rather well, and kind of relates to a comment or question I got on that video, where Money and Bones asked me, "Hey dude, can you please do a similar review for the Phantom Menace 23 years later? Particularly, how did you feel about the two-headed NASCAR announcer, poodoo, fart jokes, aliens that draw comparisons with old racial stereotypes, and so forth?" After 15 years of hyping the tragedy of Darth Vader, reading amazing 1990s EU novels, and playing all those wild old video games like Dark Forces, TIE Fighter, and whatnot, what were your feelings on the state of the franchise walking out of the cinema in 1999? Can't wait for this. Okay, so before answering that question or questions, there's a couple things to keep in mind. First, I was 21 years old when The Phantom Menace came out, and the 16-year wait between it coming out and me having seen Return of the Jedi for the first time as a 5-year-old, well, that felt like an absolute eternity, because it encompassed basically my whole childhood. And as most of you probably already know or have experienced, especially if you're a bit on the older side, your perception of time changes as you age. A year when you are a kid feels a hell of a lot longer than a year does now when you're older. And so as someone who lived and breathed Star Wars as a kid, who watched all the films somewhere in the ballpark of 100 times each, and literally wore out the VHS tapes, especially Return of the Jedi, to the point where I had to eject them from the machine at certain points and then manually move them forward because certain parts just would no longer play, who with his first ever paycheck from a real job bought new VHS tapes, bought the then just released THX remastered versions. Well, let's just say I was super excited for the Phantom Menace to come out. So excited in fact that, and I'm almost ashamed to admit this, and I should be, but I got mad because my girlfriend at the time, her boss, got to go to an advanced screening like 2 days early or something, and I was mad because he wasn't really a Star Wars fan, not like me anyway, and I didn't think he deserved it. In other words, yeah, I understand the mindset of someone who just wants to love Star Wars and refuses to ever think really critically about it or sees it as some type of betrayal to do so. Because I was that fan when The Phantom Menace came out.
Well, of course I know him. He's me.
And so if you ask me what I thought about all those things in relation to the film back then, how did I feel about it 23 years ago when walking out of the theater for the first time, the first of 9 times seeing it in the theater, or 10 if you count the 3D edition from about a decade ago, and who saw it 4 times opening day alone, well, I loved the movie, and none of those things bothered me at all. Or at least that's what I would have told you and what I was telling myself and what I actually more or less even believed. And it's kind of amazing how easily we can deceive ourselves or let ourselves be deceived by others when we want to be deceived, when we want to believe something. Because yeah, somewhere down deep there was this feeling that was telling me, maybe screaming at me, I don't know, that something wasn't quite right with the film, that it wasn't the masterpiece I would claim it to be. Which isn't to say that I now hate the movie, far from it, or that if I was completely honest with myself back then, I would have hated it. Because in this really strange sort of way, and I don't know if this will even make sense or not, but I actually enjoy the movie more today, genuinely enjoy it, than I fake enjoyed it back then. That looking at it with a critical eye, recognizing the flaws and faults, yet at the same time appreciating the good parts, makes me enjoy it more. That I'm somehow happier with my honest take of the film than I was with my it's good because I want it to be good take. It's more liberating, you could say, which makes sense because being honest with yourself usually does have that effect. And I know this almost certainly wasn't the answer or the type of video the comment was looking for, and so to briefly, and I say briefly because yes, this could be a very long film if I commented on every kind of feeling or reaction I think I would have had, but to briefly put my current mindset, my more critical, yet almost ironically enough, more understanding and accepting mindset, and it's funny how that works, isn't it? The more you're willing to just even examine your own beliefs, the more accepting of others you'll become. But anyway, to put my current, much more analytical mindset back into 1999 me in order to react to the Phantom Menace, and thus wiping clean everything that's happened with the franchise since I would have no way of knowing what has happened in this previous 23 years. Well, I almost hate to admit it because, again, I do actually today very much enjoy the film, but I would probably be rather harsh towards Episode 1, mainly criticizing how underutilized Darth Maul was, and again, having no way of knowing that him being killed off means he'll be back later in the Clone Wars and have this fantastic story arc. I'd also almost certainly complain about how childish the film feels, especially after reading the EU books, which the original comment asked me about. How did I feel about the film compared to them back then? Because those books, the EU books at the time, are not really intended for a younger audience. They are meant for a more mature audience for sure, for the kids who grew up with the original trilogy and wanted those stories to continue, and to evolve into something more suited for their current age. Which was, I think, the biggest problem or reason why some fans really did not like The Phantom Menace. For better or worse, right or wrong on George Lucas's part, I think they expected Star Wars to evolve and be a bit more mature now. Which isn't to say the originals weren't mature or anything. They are not the quintessential kids movie by any stretch. They are certainly much, much more for all ages than they are flat out for children. However, the inclusion of Jar Jar Binks, at least, is strictly for children, or intended strictly for them. I'm certainly not saying you as an adult, if you've seen the movie back then, couldn't have enjoyed the character. That's certainly fine. But clearly that character is meant to appeal to children first and foremost, and is far more slapstick than anything else seen in the original trilogy. And so the problem essentially becomes that not only does the Phantom Menace not take a step forward in, for a lack of a better way of putting it, but in maturity level, which plenty of fans I think expected it would, or just kind of assumed it would, even if not consciously thinking about it. But not only did it not take that step forward, but it kind of takes a step backwards. The Phantom Menace certainly feels like the most kid-friendly of the Star Wars films, and I think it would almost certainly be one of my biggest takeaways from the Phantom Menace if, again, current mindset me could go back to 1999 21-year-old me, which would be awesome, and if I could see it again through new eyes. Though that said, it was already one of the reasons why many were indeed critical of that film back then. I'm not bringing forth any sort of major revelation about the Phantom Menace right now. I know that. I'm simply pointing out that back then I ignored it, whereas now I wouldn't. And certainly plenty of people back then did not ignore Jar Jar Binks and how they felt about him. In fact, the character was so heavily criticized that, as you may have heard before, George Lucas changed his plans for Jar Jar Binks going forward, greatly reducing his role in the trilogy. Which means, assuming you believe the theory, the fans may very well have killed the idea of Darth Jar Jar, which would have either been the greatest or worst twist or reveal in the history of film. I don't think there's much in between with that one. And though I'm personally skeptical of the Darth Jar Jar theory, I'm still curious what Jar Jar's initial role would have been, or was he always destined to just kind of be the puppet used by Palpatine to get the clone army made? Was that the plan and Lucas would have just given us more Jar Jar, more kind of over-the-top Jar Jar, or would he have kind of calmed down as the trilogy went on? Who knows? All I do know is that it is something I would like to know, but is one of those things that we probably never will know for sure. Well, that's all I got for you this time. Now it's your turn to take to the comments below and tell me what you think the reaction would be to the Phantom Menace today. Or by all means, ask me a question that maybe I'll cover in a future video. Just start your comment out with something like, "Hey Thor," and then ask away. Though do be aware, I certainly can't turn every question I may get into a video. But one of my favorite things to do here, the main reason I started this channel in the first place years ago, was to just talk some Star Wars. So do leave those comments below, ask your questions, and let's talk some Star Wars.